All right, well, let's go ahead and get started here. Appreciate again everybody joining us for our monthly webinar here at Datamark Technologies this month. We're going to focus on a document review of NENA-INF-046, which we'll get into the details of here momentarily. I'm Jeff Ledbetter, public safety GIS expert here on the Datamark team. I like to say that I'm webinar famous, so you may have seen my face before on this very screen, but if not, just to let you know a little bit about my background, I've been working with GIS technology since 1998. I'm a full-fledged GIS nerd and happy to be so. 2009, I began working in the public safety industry and haven't stopped since. The purpose-driven industry and job has greatly fulfilled me, and I'm excited to be here with you all talking about this topic today. So I'll go ahead and pause my camera so that we can conserve bandwidth and not have any issues there. Again, operationalizing GIS in the transitional phase of NG901 is our topic today. I had the good fortune of being a co-chair of the working group that produced, I should say, this NENA GIS data transition information document. It goes all the way back to the SBP Standards and Best Practices Conference of 2018. There was a presentation given that really highlighted the fact that there was some peculiarities and interesting stuff in a transitional state for GIS data in a transitional state of NG911 that really was kind of a gap in the body of documents that NENA had produced. There was a desire to provide some guidance to GIS professionals as they might create and prepare, maintain GIS data for 911. There was already efforts underway, and some had reached the point of publishing, but were at least underway to really cover the topics that were about what does an in-state GIS data set need to look like in order to meet the needs, not only the GIS data standards that are part of the body of standards at NENA, but also the particular needs of an in-state I3 NG911 call routing system. There had also been produced some documents, one in particular, NENA 71501, that were attempts to sort of give advice on, as that I3 standard was evolving in the 2009-2010 timeframe, what could GIS professionals be kind of working on in order to get their data ready to be ready, if that makes sense, ready to find the requirements and definitions of an in-state NG911 system once they were ready. And so that document was published in 2009 or so, had some recommendations and some steps that had sort of evolved away from all of the advice, not all of the advice, some of the advice in that document. And so in 2018, 2019, there was this desire to kind of create a document that would update the recommendations out of some of those older documents and give some real experience-based perspective on how to manage GIS data in a transitional phase. And we'll talk about what transitional means here in just a moment. But that was the origin of this NENA-INF-046, what would ultimately numbered in that way. 2019 in May or so, we started up work with the working group. 35 to 40 contributors, probably a lot of you on this webinar were contributors to it as well. Myself, Jessica Fry from GeoCom, and John Strebe from the East Texas Council of Governments were the co-chairs. And and I'll just say, before we dive into the details of the document, the experience as a co-chair is quite an intense one. And I'm glad that I was only a co-chair of a group that was working on an INF document, not a standard. But nonetheless, the leadership requirements, the organizational requirements, the document writing and editing requirements were pretty intensive. But it was a very rewarding experience, and one that I would do again under the right circumstances with the right type of document. And I think this was a really good experience for me in regards to that. The working group worked together, uh, drafted what would become a 68-page working group document, information document. 68 pages is not that big of a document, to be fair, relative to some of the other information or standard documents. But it was important stuff that requires very specific focus that we'll talk about here in just a moment. The process was pretty substantial. It took that long also because we took a few pauses in our progress as some of the other standards and information documents, specifically the GIS data model standard, came to a V2, and the information document for GIS data stewardship for that end state of NG901 also came to a new version that included more work and more advice. So we took a pause for a little while to be sure that our advice in this document lined up with that and did not contradict it. And I think that pause was well advised and worth taking, but it did create a little bit of a delay in actually outputting the document. Then almost just as much time passed as we got through an all committee review and 2 public reviews and resolution of comments and all of those. So it was quite a process, and all of these publishing processes are. But this document was finally published in September of this year. And so I'm excited to bring this webinar and talk about some of the content of that document so that our audience of GIS professionals and those who work with them in a public safety capacity can begin to kind of take in the recommendations and begin to enact them in their day-to-day workflows. So where does this document fit in? And I'll be sure to give credit to Richard Kelly for this slide and the concept of the slide, but I think it's a really good graphic and construct that gives a picture of where this document fits into the process in terms of standards and informational documents from NENA for the preparation and maintenance of GIS data for NG901 call routing. The engine of the train, we'll use the train analogy because it is something of a linear progression, but there's plenty of argument to be made that it's much more 3D than that, and that's fair. But the analogy of a train works out with the engine being STA O&O, the standard that is the I3 architecture that GIS people generally aren't going to be the audience of, and certainly we have some exceptional colleagues in this slice of the industry that can both be a GIS professional and read and understand STA 010, but that's a small group of which I am not a member. I don't pretend to be a STA O&O expert, but certainly I've learned a lot through the authoring of this document and the reading of others that are pieces of it. But it gives the design, right, that is the engine driving NG901, STA 004, the CLDXF, the Civic Location Data Exchange format, provides conveyance format as a standard for location data in NG911. That impacts recommendations found in RAQ 002, which is about 3D GIS. Our REQ documents share requirements and not actual standards, right? So they're not standard requirements, but rather they are requirements of topics and information that need to go into standards or informational documents. Those two things together, STAL 040 and REQ 002, are rolled up into and sort of made practical by STAL 006, the GIS data model, where we are given actual standard requirements for what GIS data should look like in order to work within that construct of STAL 010. As I mentioned already, Data Stewardship INF-028 is a great document that focuses on the end state of NG901 and GIS data management for that. Great recommendations around polygons and road center lines and how to create and maintain those for that end state system. As I mentioned earlier, the gap was sort of identified that there were some specific things to a transitional state of NG901 GIS data that should be enumerated, and that was what this INF 046 does, as I mentioned earlier. But you can see this is where it sort of fits in. And then there is a document, STAL 005, formerly the provisioning and maintenance, a standard for provisioning and maintenance of GIS data to ECRFs and LVFs, that is in the process of being deprecated and being replaced with an informational document that will be referred to as the utilization of GIS data in NGCS. I am on the working group there. It's a great place to learn a lot about from that select slice of our industry that understand GIS data and STAL O&O. And I would highly encourage anybody to join the effort currently being undertaken by that working group if you understand the things that are the subject, as well as if you want to learn about those subjects. And so that document, as it gets produced, kind of hooked on here. We show it as sort of the caboose, but I'm not sure that it actually is the caboose. But join us and see what you think about that topic. Incidentally, that working group, I will be a part of a presentation that working group will be making at the Standards and Best Practices Conference in Clearwater, Florida in January. And I'll make a pitch for that later, but I recommend that if you're interested in this topic, that would be a great place to be in January. So back specifically about INF 046, the GIS data transition information document. Its audience is GIS data providers, right? It was geared and written for the consumption and understanding of people that are producing GIS data to be used in both NG901 systems as well as legacy 901 systems during a transitional phase. That doesn't mean that that it's super GIS-y technical, but it does mean that we weren't speaking to more operational impacts of this. Instead, we were speaking to GIS data impacts of this topic, if that makes sense. So what I've done today, I'll just by way of introduction to kind of format of the webinar, the last document review, I did this as well. What I've done today is sort of just give some quotes from the document, and I'll do my best not to just read these quotes to you, but I wanted the document to speak for itself because it is well curated and peer reviewed, and the language in it is succinct. And so I'll explain or expound a little bit on each one of these quotes as we come to them, and hopefully that will make sense for you. But on this topic of what exactly is this document about, I'll just read this quote for you. While those documents, STAL 006 and INF 012 or 028, Focus on the GIS needs of an in-state NG901 system. This document provides guidance for migrating GIS data from the current state to that end state. Following the recommendations presented herein should result in more accurate, efficient, and reliable operation of GIS data dependent services within transitional NG901 systems. So, what is transition is a topic that we'll dive into next. That transitional state, right, moving from wherever you're at to the end state of I3, brings its own sort of goals and realities, right? Transitioning GIS data from its current state to a state that supports NG901 may occur in different ways and with different methods, right? However, the outcome is the same. GIS data to support geospatial call routing, location validation, other next-gen 911 core services, or NGCS. And so we emphasize here that a particular jurisdiction's journey to an end state of NG911 will be unique, right? Because they have their own unique mix of legacy systems. They have their own unique mix of sort of over-the-top and transitional systems that may or may not use GIS data. And then they'll have their own unique configuration of end state services as well. And so they'll happen in different ways and with different methods, but ultimately everything has to get to that end state described in STA 010, STA 006, and INF 028. During transition, all GIS data layers need to fulfill both enhanced or E901 and NG901 requirements. The transition period is likely to be lengthy and in most cases will be executed in a phased approach, with each phase having its own requirements for GIS data. Upon completion of full transition to end-state NG901, select legacy features, attributes, and datasets may no longer be necessary. And so just to acknowledge and fully define, right, what that transitional period is and is intended to be, is the one in which you're performing dual maintenance of GIS datasets alongside legacy 901 databases such as MSAG and ALI that have to do with location. And so again, I'll just emphasize that it's likely to be lengthy and will be executed in a phased approach. So disabuse yourself of the notion that there will be sort of this light switch moment where one day you're all on legacy and the next day after the switch gets flipped, you're all on an in-state I3 911 system. It's not going to work that way, right? It's going to be a process to get your GIS data ready. It's going to be a process to create the constellation of services that will constitute an in-state NG911 system. There will be steps where you have an EZInet and no next-gen core services. There will be stages where you have an EZInet and next-gen core services, and there will still be some legacy PSAPs out there that will be sending location data in legacy formats. And so we have to build GIS data sets that will address all the needs of all of those particular systems and situations as they arise. So that's a big challenge, and that's why we wound up writing and having peer-reviewed a 68-page document that discusses some of the requirements and challenges in that topic. Some high points of the document. We talk about the data transition from legacy to NG, what those both mean, what kind of data sets are in legacy, what kind of data sets are in NG911, how those data sets are related to and interact with one another. We talked about the responsibilities of stakeholders in GIS data transition. The people that create data, the people that maintain data, the people that consume data, the people that manage systems with data, and the people that use those systems. They're all kind of highlighted in this document. We get into the weeds of civic address location fields as well. I think this is a very important section of the document. This is where we really talk about the relationship to next generation 911 road names and parsing, and how that is keyed to the legacy fields um, of the same road names, but to be formatted according to legacy databases. It's important because GIS data is the place where the link between a location in legacy is made to a location in an NG system. We'll talk more about that here in just a moment. Address number and range fields as well, not just the road name fields, but also the address number and range fields. And community attribution. Community attribution sometimes is confusing. And there are fields in the GIS data model that are community fields that are there because they exist in E91 systems, but may, as pointed out earlier in the quote, won't be necessary in an in-state system. So we dove into the details on that as well. We sought to clarify the concept of emergency service numbers and emergency service zones, even all the way into the weeds of what an English language translation or an ELT is, because people that have not been deeply involved in legacy 911 database management in the past may not understand some of the nuances of those things. And understanding the nuances of ESNs, ESCs, and ELTs will help you make that transition to NG901 and ensure that your GIS data is formatted properly. And then we undertook a section to specifically discuss quality control. There was a lot of us in the working group that really wanted to come up with, like, here's some really good specific things without setting a standard. But here's some really good specific things that you need to be paying attention to in your GIS data so that it meets the quality needs of both legacy and NG911. Especially in those latter topics, we sort of took a frequently asked questions approach to formatting the information in the document. And really, the way that came about is there was enough people on the working group that had experience either completely making the transition or they were in the throes of transition, and some that had very little experience, but they gave us great perspective in terms of what are the questions you have, what are the things, if you've been through a transition, what are the things you wish knew then that you know now. And that all sort of culminated in this frequently asked questions for where we would imagine what those questions might be and then give an appropriate answer that generally fits the question to each of them. And those were specifically about those last 2 or 3 bullet items. We did that. Topic of synchronization is interesting. And again, I referenced already the NENA document 71501 from the 2010 era. It gave some specific advice that was very broad and general, and we wanted to kind of zero in some things about synchronization that were mentioned in that document and were useful about that document, but sort of bring them into a more evolved context of the current day. And so again, I'll just read this quote to you from the document. As the transition progresses, conflicting information between the Master Street Address Guide, or MSAG, the Automatic Location Identification, or ALI, and GIS databases may arise. Realistically, that should say will arise, right? It's generic language, though, so we had to adjust that a little bit. But the likelihood is these situations will arise. Continuing on, also GIS database schemas may be different between jurisdictions and or may need to change over time, requiring continued upkeep of the 911 databases, e.g. legacy databases, to NENA NG901 GIS data model version 1 from to version 2 or higher, right? In other words, these databases will never be complete, right? They will never be done, quote unquote, done. There will always be work to do in terms of maintaining them, but the maintenance work will be less than sort of the heavy lift of the preparation work. And we also wanted to emphasize that it's important to not work in a vacuum, that in fact you can't work in a vacuum as a GIS professional in these efforts. And so I'll just read this quote. Maintaining data integrity within the GIS, IMSAG, and ALI requires high levels of coordination to resolve discrepancies. Synchronization of the IMSAG, ALI, and GIS data may require coordination between these different roles. 911 authority, GIS data provider, IMSAG coordinator, addressing authority, and originating service provider, OSP. Achieving and maintaining data synchronization requires a clearly communicated process with specific documented procedures. Again, the experience of those who had made it through the transition really made it clear that these relationships were as much a part of the successful creation of useful data and maintenance of it as was the GIS technology that created it, right? Or anything else. It was as much about relationships and processes, right? If you've ever watched Marcus Lemonis' show, The Prophet, I'm a big fan of that show back when it was on. He used to focus on people, process, and product, right? And so that's exactly the point here as well. You cannot leave out the people part of the people, process, and product equation and be successful. We also emphasize that it's not about taking the schema that's revealed in the standard GIS data model and making it your database. Instead, we emphasize that the ETL, the extract, translate, and load process is your friend. So I'll just read this quote. GIS data to support NG901 systems may be maintained in the NENA NG901 GIS data model or locally in a multi-use format that supports multiple GIS data uses. When maintained in a local format, the data will need to be extracted, translated, and loaded, ETL'd, into the NENA NG901 GIS data model to support NG901 components for call routing and location validation, as well as other data systems, including PSAP and response agency mapping applications. And so, if you're a GIS professional, but you're not extensive, you don't have extensive database skills, this is your flag, right, to go out and learn some things about extract, translate, and load processes and use them. Use them in your daily work as it relates to this effort. I'll just read this quote. Upon completion of full transition to in-state NG901, select legacy features, attributes, and datasets may no longer be necessary. Also, NGCS providers may have additional requirements. As such, discussions with the NGCS providers regarding the GIS data requirements should occur in the planning phase to ensure the GIS data provider can support all systems. And so the point of this is that even when you get there, I think we've already said it today, even when you get there, your work will not stop, right? Your work will be different. Some things that are in legacy databases will go away. In fact, some legacy databases, period, will go away, but others will persist. And as we emphasized earlier, everybody's journey will be different and occur in different ways with different tools and different requirements. And even when you get there, that NGCS provider will have requirements that aren't necessarily defined by the standards, right? They are defined by their requirements, but are still compatible with or meet the intent of the standards. And so just again emphasizing that even though there's a transition from a current state to an end state, once you get to the end state, you are not done. And emphasize as well that this data will be multi-use in nature. I think you heard that in the last couple of quotes as well. So I'll just read this one. It is important to keep in mind that local GIS will continue to support a variety of applications within and outside the PSAP, and the requirements for these systems must be acknowledged and included in the planning process in order to mitigate any negative impacts on all local systems supported by GIS. So, not only in public safety is this true, but also outside of public safety, it's true as well. Road center lines, address points, and boundaries tend to form foundational data layers for all sorts of applications across the government enterprise, especially to include public safety, as that is our focus here on the DataMark Technologies team, as well as you, if you're watching this webinar, at least in part. But it's important to remember that because it's multi-use in nature, your particular data set will need to be defined in a way that meets all of those multiple uses that your jurisdiction has. And so, again, some document highlights specifically. We talked a lot in here about some common questions. I talked about our FAQ format. Here's a few examples of that as it relates to community attributes. And I'm not seeking to answer these questions today, but only to highlight the fact that the document has these questions and peer-reviewed answers. And so I want to point everybody to the document, NENA-INF-046, GIS Data Transition Information Document, for the answers to these questions. But here's some examples of the questions that are generally answered. Things like, why are MSAG communities different than the postal communities? Can they be the same? Why do NG911 community fields not include the MSAG community attributes? Why do my jurisdiction's MSAG communities not reference anything that exists today? That happens out there. And does it make sense to update the MSAG community to values that exist in the real world? These are all questions that the 35 to 40 folks that were part of the working group identified as meaningful questions that we could answer, that, again, they wish they had known an answer to when they started the process. So I just wanted to give you a little example of that FAQ format and the types of things that we covered. As I said earlier, we also did put some effort into demystifying the ESN and ESC, and so I want to emphasize that here today for you as well. An ESN is a 3 to 5 digit number that represents one or more ESCs, that is emergency service zones, stored as a 3 to 5 character numeric string in a GIS database. An ESN is defined as one of two types: administrative ESN and routing ESN. So we got really down into the weeds about ESNs, because my suspicion is that even a number of folks that have been through the effort to begin preparing data for NG911 may not fully understand the difference between ESN and routing ESN, and sometimes that leads to misunderstandings about conflicts in reading and interpreting legacy database attributes sometimes as well. So we felt like it was important to elucidate those things. The second quote here, an ESZ is a geographical area that represents a unique combination of emergency service agencies, e.g. law enforcement, fire, and emergency medical service, that are within a specified 911 governing authority's jurisdiction. An ESC can be represented by an ESN to identify the ESZ. And so again, very high level, that's the difference between the two. We sought to embrace the graphical nature of we GIS nerds and present some graphics and some tables that show how the relationship between ESN and ESZs work together. So I definitely recommend everybody take a look at that, those sections. Again, I referenced earlier the English language translation, or the ELT examples. Here's some good work we did to kind of, again, demonstrate in graphic format the relationship between administrative ESNs, routing ESNs, PSAP name, law, fire, EMS, etc., and the ELTs that are assigned to them. We also recommended, kind of in like fashion of the GIS data stewardship document, as they recommended a phased approach for creating in-state GIS data. We created a recommendation for a phased approach for creating and maintaining transitional GIS data. And one of the things we recommended, which may not be the right thing for every jurisdiction, but will be the right thing for a lot of jurisdictions, is the creation of MSAG community and ESN ESC polygons in order to properly populate legacy data fields. As then phase 2, move into that synchronization phase, which is where those discrepancies between the GIS data and the legacy databases get identified and get ironed out to the extent possible. And then the third phase was NG91 readiness support. And specifically, we spoke about the concept of a GIS-derived MSAG and gave some recommendations on ways that dual maintenance of both databases may be efficient and streamlined. Specifically about the creation of the community and ESN ESC polygons, we stated that maintaining accurate information critical to the E91 ALI and MSAG systems, such as ESN and MSAG community name attributes on road centerline and site structure address point layers, is necessary to ensure the GIS data is capable of supporting the transition to NG91. To facilitate the development, refinement, and maintenance of the road center line and site structure address point layers required for the transition to NG91, it is important to create GIS layers that accurately represent the geographic extent of the MSAG communities and the ESN. So again, that was a recommendation made. For the legacy database synchronization, it states synchronization is the first step to the ultimate reconciliation and subsequent temporary dual maintenance of the GIS data to the legacy 901 databases. Successful synchronization of GIS and legacy 901 databases result in GIS data that contains the attributes necessary to successfully route legacy calls, 911 calls. And so we learned a lot about some of the in-state processes and things like functional elements like the MSAG conversion service. And we did our best to kind of explain what those are and why those need this connection made in the GIS data between those legacy databases and the in-state GIS. Synchronization is used to identify and resolve these issues and make datasets answer questions in the same way. So what we did here was we came up with kind of the most common synchronization issues that our working group sort of collectively found. Things like MSAG ranges that do not exist in RCL, RCL ranges that aren't included in the MSAG, ALI addresses that are not represented in the site structure address point. A lack of data integrity, that is that the attributes in the road centerline don't align with the attributes in the address point or those legacy databases, MSAG and ALI, as well as things like shell records in ALI and MSAG that are not and should not be reflected in GIS data. We dove into some of the details on that. So if you're trying to come up with a way to define database synchronization, this is a great list to start from. And therefore, your success against that synchronization can be measured really by saying that we've addressed these particular bullet points. Some of the key takeaways from the document, again, we're going to come back to kind of the high points, but the resulting statements that I really want to emphasize here is that transition from Legacy 901 to NG 901 is an evolutionary process involving technical, operational, economic, and institutional change. In some cases, the path to NG 901 implementation will depend on the underlying infrastructure of the public safety answering point and the 911 authorities involved. And so just to focus on the fact that this isn't all a GIS issue, right? In fact, the GIS issues are there in service of the PSAP and 911 authorities' needs as they transition, but also maintain their legacy routing infrastructure. We also wanted to make a statement that makes clear that there is not just one metric of GIS data readiness for NG 911. Over time, that document 71501 came to be a sort of de facto standard. People refer to it as a standard, even though it never was a standard document, and it didn't offer a sort of endpoint metric, though it kind of became that. And the group felt strongly that we should address that specifically with the quote that I'll read now. It says the metrics of GIS data readiness are individual to the particular layer. Setting an arbitrary goal such as 98% of what, of anything really, right, gives the illusion that there is an objective measure of readiness, although some jurisdictions and/or NGCS providers may have policies requiring percentage match criteria. On that same topic, rather than a single metric, we came up with this list. GIS data readiness is achieved when data owners and PSAP authorities can proceed with confidence that the following conditions exist. GIS data is free of critical errors. Critical errors are data issues that would prevent its use in a specified NGCS. Because of that, the requirements of a specific NGCS should be used to determine if you're free of critical errors. Secondly, GIS data legacy road names align as well as possible with road names contained in the legacy 911 databases. Thirdly, that GIS data road ranges encompass all alley locations. So even though alley is about locations and specific addresses, it also has a relationship to the road ranges. Fourthly, that the MSAG community name and ESN are properly attributed in GIS data. It's important for those legacy fields to be attributed if you are existing in a transitional state. And fifthly, that GIS data represents a substantially accurate and complete model of real-world locations in the given geography. So while that's not like a easily quantifiable, here's your 98%, what that means is if you can say with confidence that you have a substantially accurate and complete model of the real world in the given jurisdiction's geography, then your GIS data is ready to transition, ready for an in-state NG 911. The group felt like it was really important to kind of give that overall definition that while it's not super objective, but states the components that have to be assessed as to whether or not they are quote unquote ready. And then again, like I said, we talked about this concept of a GIS derived MSAG, which is the resulting tabular database of GIS data, typically the road centerline layer. The minimum GIS data model fields needed to derive the MSAG include address and range fields, legacy street name fields, parity, MSAG community name, and ESN in certain cases. The format and GIS requirements of a GIS-derived MSAG and may vary by service provider. And so we get into the details of what a GIS-derived MSAG may look like, but it all, of course, with a asterisk next to it that says based on your NGCS provider's requirements. For civic addresses that do not correspond to road centerline segment, MSAGs derived from road centerline layer may need to be augmented with single address entries from site structure address point layer, right? So that's one case where MSAG is more than just a distillation of your road centerline names. There may be some augmentation that's required. As well, special purpose MSAG records, such as those used to support foreign exchange, voice over IP, wireless testing, and training, will need to be part of the derived MSAG as well, and will continue to be maintained by the providers. This represents all the things in your alley that should never go in a GIS dataset, but do need to be in the alley, do need to be a part of the MSAG in order to function in legacy systems. In the creation of a GIS-derived MSAG, 911 authorities and GIS data providers must work closely with bordering PSAPs, as there are often MSAG records for identical road segments found in both legacy MSAGs. These identical road segments typically cover the same ranges and street names, but have each PSAP's own MSAG community name and ESN. In a GIS-derived MSAG, only one PSAP can contain an MSAG record for each range and street name. These issues are typically discovered during the alley to road centerline synchronization process. So just another note about the distinction of a GIS-derived MSAG. And a GIS-derived MSAG may be developed utilizing multiple authoritative sources. GIS data providers and 911 authorities must closely coordinate to ensure completeness and accuracy of the GIS data used to derive the MSAG. So all that to emphasize that the idea of a GIS-derived MSAG is very possible, but there are some things that you have to pay attention to as you produce that MSAG out of GIS data. So that's what I have for you today in terms of the review of the document. There's much more to the document that I just simply didn't have time to cover in the level of detail that I would love to cover. But those were the high points and the key takeaways from the creation of the document. And I'll open up the floor here for questions. If you have any conversation in the chat, we'll address those things. But I'll just, before I do that, pitch a couple of QR codes at you. And one is the page on NENA's website where you can join a working group. The data transition working group is currently not stood up, so you won't find it there. However, I highly recommend finding one and joining one so that you may enjoy some benefits of learning. That utilization of GIS data in NGCS is a great working group of which I'm a part. And if you want to learn some of the ins and outs of those NGCS functional elements, it's a great working group to learn that in. And then again, at the bottom here, I'll just drop another mention of the NENA Standards and Best Practices Conference, which is January 12th to 15th in Clearwater, Florida. It's a great conference because it focuses really on learning and education about standards and best practices and networking with other professionals that are doing the same. So highly recommend NENA SBP. It's well worth your efforts. And then, of course, if you have any specific questions, I've got my contact information here. I'd love to hear from anybody who has any questions about the document or about concepts in the document or anything else for that matter. So at this point, let me just check the chat here, see what we have. Yeah, great. Somebody put in the link to the document, and that would have been a smart thing for me to do, wouldn't it? Appreciate you doing that for me. Maybe we can include that in our follow-up email as well. Yeah, looks like no specific questions here. So I really appreciate everybody joining. I hope that the content was useful for you. Oh, James has a question there, doesn't he? Okay. How do I dip my toes in with NENA? Don't want to join a group at this time. Well, dip your toes in by attending some stuff. SBP is a great thing to attend. Working group, if you don't have time to dedicate to a working group, you know, take advantage of opportunities such as this, where there are webinars and other educational opportunities to kind of learn about things. And then also, I would recommend just joining what's called the NENA Development Group, the NDG. And you do that by joining a work group, but you can keep up with the progress of certain documents and standards through joining that NENA development group as well. And yes, Alexander, we will be sending out a link to the recording of this webinar, which will be a YouTube link with a follow-up email to everybody who's registered to attend today's session. So again, I appreciate everybody's time and your dedication to the public safety industry. And I wish you a good day, and feel free to reach out and let me know if you have any questions I can help with. Thanks, everybody.